Thank you for standing by and welcome to the Invex Therapeutics quarterly conference call. All participants are in a listen-only mode. There will be a presentation followed by a question and answer session. If you wish to ask a question, you will need to press the star key followed by the number 1 on your telephone keypad. I would now like to hand the conference over to Dr. Tom Duthy, Executive Director. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Ashley, and good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to present to you a summary of the company's financial performance and quarterly activities for the 3 months ended 31 December 2022, being our Q2 FY23. I trust all of you on today's call have had a chance to read the announcement as lodged with ASX this morning. I will now provide an overview of the company's second quarter performance and our outlook for the next 6 months to 30 June 2023. As always, I'd like to start with our financials before turning to our operational update. The company closed the quarter in a continued strong financial position with cash and cash equivalents of 25.4 million versus 27.3 million in Q1 FY23, with overall operating cash outflows for the quarter of 1.9 million versus 2 million in the previous quarter. As I've also mentioned before, as we expand the IAH Evolve Phase 3 trial in earnest during 2023 via additional clinical site expansion, activation and acceleration of patient recruitment, plus new regulatory approvals in additional territories, we will progressively incur a higher level of expenditure moving forward. In summary, our cash outflows from operating expenditure included R&D expenditure for the quarter of 1.9 million versus 1.1 million in Q1 FY23, and this reflected costs associated with our contract research organisation managing our Phase 3 trial, along with our clinical regulatory consultant work and intellectual property costs. Our admin and corporate costs of 0.32 million were slightly higher than Q1, and these fees include compliance costs associated with being a listed ASX company, director fees, audit and legals. Our government grant and tax incentives were 0.45 million compared to nil in Q1 FY23. As some may recall, on 1 November 2022, we announced the receipt of £254,000 to the company's wholly owned UK subsidiary from the UK government for eligible R&D expenditures made by Invex during the 2022 financial year. Invex does anticipate an increase in UK rebates and the commencement of Australian R&D tax rebates this financial year. Despite a challenging biotech market generally in 2022, it's pleasing Invex is fully funded to complete the IAH Evolve Phase 3 trial for Presendin registration purposes in the EU, UK and Australia from our current cash reserves. I'd like to turn now to the operating highlights. As we said in the ASX release this morning, the company's made excellent progress in the necessary preparative work associated with the commencement of the trial during Q2, with a necessary focus on additional regulatory approvals, while in parallel working with selected clinical sites to activate these centres to permit the commencement of patient recruitment into the trial. During the quarter, the company successfully activated 2 clinical sites in the UK and Australia. The first 2, in fact. The opening of the company's first site in the UK at University Hospital Birmingham was with Professor Molan and is expected to be an important site for Invex. Professor Molan is a globally recognised clinician and researcher in the field of idiopathic intracranial hypertension, IH, which is our core clinical indication, having authored a significant number of peer-reviewed publications in the field and co-authored the current consensus treatment guidelines for IH used by clinicians across the globe. In Australia, the company's first clinical site was activated at Vision SA in Adelaide, South Australia, under the supervision of Associate Professor Celia Chen, who is also a principal investigator for the trial in Australia. Dr. Chen is also widely regarded in the field of neuro-ophthalmology. Our biggest milestone for the quarter was the commencement of patient recruitment, with the first patient randomised into the IAH Evolve trial in Adelaide at Vision SA on 21 November 2022. This was a pleasing result for the company leading into Christmas. Recruitment is expected to now accelerate as the holiday period completes in Australia and clinicians return from leave. As at 31 December 2022, the company had selected 39 clinical sites to participate in the trial across the globe, following a comprehensive qualification process. This compared to 34 as at Q1 FY23. The number of activated sites as at 31 December 2022 was 5, versus nil at Q1 FY23. The company's last regulatory approval during the quarter was received from the New Zealand Medicines and Medical Devices Safety Authority, MedSafe, which also included formal approval from the New Zealand Health and Disability Ethics Committee, which was a requirement to undertake clinical trials of new medicines like Presendin in New Zealand. As we've mentioned previously, the decision to allow IAH patients from New Zealand into our trial reflects the increasing incidence of IAH in this population, consistent with increasing rates of obesity. Turning now to the approval of our Paediatric Investigation Plan, or PIP, approved by the European Medicines Agency, or the EMA. On the 14th of December 22, we announced the Paediatric Committee of the European Medicines Agency, as I mentioned, EMA, accepted the company's PIP for the development of Presendin for IAH in pubescent boys and girls aged less than 18. Included in this PIP approval was a decision adopting a waiver for Invex from conducting a trial in pre-pubertal males and females, typically less than 12 years of age, and includes a deferral allowing for this paediatric trial to commence after the receipt of positive data from Invex's IAH Evolve Phase 3 trial in an adult IAH population. Basically, this means Invex is required to invest in an adolescent-led clinical trial only if we are successful in the adult Phase 3 trial. Accordingly, there is no financial investment into this trial required ahead of our results. It is important to note, however, that in the European Union, sponsors must possess a compliant PIP prior to applying for market approval of new drugs. A successful outcome to our proposed paediatric trial, or adolescent trial, I should say, would permit an additional market authorization in Europe for IAH, expanding potential access to this population for Presendin. Turning briefly now to our outlook, Invex continues to progress our Phase 3 clinical trial, IAH Evolve, and we expect a number of additional corporate milestones in the first half of calendar year 2023. These include the first site activated in the United States, which pleasingly we have already achieved on the 19th of January. We also expect hospital clearance and Ministry of Health approval in Israel to commence recruitment in that market, along with National Competent Authority approval and ethics clearance in Germany, once again to commence patient recruitment in Germany. We also expect our first sites activated in New Zealand and first patients recruited in the US, New Zealand, Germany and Israel into this study. We continue to view the recruitment to 240 patients will take approximately 24 months. I would now like to turn the call over to Ashley for Q&A. Please go ahead, Ashley.
Thank you. If you wish to ask a question, please press star 1 on your telephone and wait for your name to be announced. If you wish to cancel your request, please press star 2. If you're on a speakerphone, please pick up the handset to ask your question. Your first question comes from Alan Soren, a private investor. Please go ahead.
Hello, Tom. My question is about interim readout. I believe that no interim readout has been planned. Could you explain why that is and why it isn't a good idea, say, halfway to look for either overwhelming efficacy or futility and thereby save half the money either way? Thank you.
It's a good question, Alan. I think as I've commented before on much the same quarterly calls, is the decision to not undertake an unblinding and interim analysis of this particular trial reflects two things. Firstly, it is an orphan population, and therefore it is a recruitment that takes probably a little longer than it would otherwise for a less rare disorder. And so by targeting 240 patients with no interim look, we would not pay a statistical penance, or we do not pay a statistical penance by unblinding that data halfway through. So compare and contrasting the costs and time associated with an interim analysis, the study investigators and our regulatory and clinical consultants, their strong view was to not include an interim analysis, principally because we would need a lot more patients to maintain the same level of statistical power on the primary endpoint, which is lowering intracranial pressure and those important secondary measures of headache and vision. So whilst it may be somewhat frustrating for investors that there's this bridge of silence while we recruit, I can assure you that was decided with the very highest regulatory and clinical consultation. And that is the best trial design that we can possibly put forward for our investors, which balances the financial cost along with the temporal or time commitment one needs to make. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Tom. No further questions.
Thanks.
Your next question comes from Richard Cho with Storage Party Limited. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, in terms of the 24-month recruitment timeline, how far do you estimate that we're into that timeline? So there's been one patient recruited. Are you kind of happy with the progress at the moment? And where did you start that 24-month period? And I guess, ultimately, when do you think that recruitment process will finish? When's the end of that 24-month period?
Yeah, so you can basically look at it's whether it's 1 month or 2 months, or do we commence it at 1 January? The fact is, we did recruit our first patient in sort of I think it was late November 2022, and of course, as you'd expect, we've got 5 activated sites, so we have only a small handful of patients recruited. So what you can expect and what our plans are, of course, as those activations start to tickle up quite profoundly to the 40 targeted sites. So 39 we've selected, up to 40 we've targeted, but we've activated. That is, that they're now able to recruit. I think on the call I mentioned this, of course, that there was 5. And so our view is that if you consider 24 months from around the November, December timeline when we started the trial, we still believe that is certainly possible. But, one needs to appreciate we are literally very early in the clinical rollout and recruitment period. And so we need a little more water under the bridge to see how that trial is progressing. But to date, and knowing what we need to attempt to do here, we need 6 patients on average over 2 years from 40 sites to get to the 240. And so, from my perspective, that looks certainly achievable, and that is the plan.
Okay, so November, December 22, so 24 months after that would be like December 24 at this stage.
Yeah, look, I wouldn't be here committing to a month necessarily,
No.
of course, but yes, I mean we will be in a much better position to either refine that down or have to refine it up once the trial really kicks off in earnest. So for the moment, it is absolutely our target, and bear in mind that 24 months is last patient recruited, but that same patient, that very last patient, call it sample number 240, that last patient does need to complete 24 weeks of treatment. So you're looking at the actual closing of the database at 24 months plus that additional 24 weeks, and then we will be able to report thereafter the top line preliminary results of the study itself. So that's sort of the way to think about that, the timeline between recruitment and also reporting.
Okay. Yep, sorry. Let me just get this straight again. So the November, December, was that when the first patient was recruited? So we're going to count
that's correct.
4 months from the first patient? Yeah. Okay, so that's what I needed to know. Because I think previously
that's
I was assuming when the registration or the clinics were approved, that's when I was counting for. But if you're going to count from the first patient, that gives me...
Yeah, that's right. We've been pretty clear, I think, for the last year or so that it's based on recruitment, not activations.
Okay.
And so our first patient is obviously within Australia, bearing in mind, as I mentioned on the call, we also sort of recruited or started to recruit just prior to Christmas. And so as you can well appreciate, not a lot happens, particularly in Australia, between sort of Christmas and Australia Day with clinicians. And so very much looking forward to, this quarter, the third quarter of our financial year, and progressively throughout the remainder of the calendar year, we'll certainly see an acceleration in site activations and recruitment.
Yeah. Okay, thanks on that. That's crystal clear now. So
pleasure.
Thank you very much.
No worries. Thanks, Richard.
Once again, if you wish to ask a question, please press star 1 on your telephone. We'll now pause a short moment to allow questions to register. There are no further questions at this time. I'll now hand back to Dr. Duthy for closing remarks.
Thanks very much, Ashley, and thanks everyone for joining the call today. We've got a number of investors on the call, which is really pleasing given the holiday period tomorrow in Australia. So we certainly look forward to our next update with you on our trial progression and those progressive regulatory approvals. And thanks again for listening.
That does conclude our conference for today. Thank you for participating. You may now disconnect.